On the line with us right now is a remarkable woman who's seen it all and done it all. She was around for some of the most pivotal and private moments in rock and roll music history. From 1968 to 1984, she worked in the music industry as an assistant and tour manager for the most influential musicians of that era. We're honored to have her on the show this week to talk about her fascinating book, Miss O'Dell, My Hard Days and Long Nights with the Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and the women they loved. Miss Chris O'Dell.
How are you?
Oh, you know me, Chris. I'm just blazing a trail through the radio airwaves as only I can do.
Yeah, great.
Chris, you've lived an extraordinary life. It's chronicled here in the book, Miss O'Dell, My Hard Days and Long Nights with the Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and the women they loved. First of all, can you come up with a longer title?
No. We tried, but we couldn't get it on the paper.
Right. Tell us a little bit about the book.
Well, it pretty much is a, what's the word I'm looking for? It pretty much tells my story, or the story of a young girl who at 20 kind of got into the music business and ended up with, the first major job really was with the Beatles at Apple, and all the way through some of the people mentioned in the title. Through my touring days, as I became a tour manager, really ending probably in the mid-'80s, in general, kind of ending during that period of time. So it's very specific to the years I spent in the rock and roll world.
Come together right now over me.
So how did you get involved with working over at Apple with the Beatles? I mean, how does that come about?
Well, I got lucky.
Uh-oh.
I wish I could give you a really good idea. I moved to L.A. from Tucson, which was kind of the next biggest city. And I met, I was working at a record company or for a guy in the music business, and I met Derek Taylor, who had been the Beatles' publicist in London. He was the Liverpudlian. And he had come to America to do some work for a couple years. And he and I met right before he was going back to work at Apple, right around the time the Beatles opened Apple. And he took a liking to me and just said, why don't you come over? This would be a good time to come over there and work at Apple. He didn't really offer me a job. He just sort of said, come over. But I knew that if I did, he would help me.
That had to be mind-blowing for you.
Well, it was all so kind of, it all happened over a period of time. And I was very reluctant to do it because back in 1968, you just didn't move to other countries like you might today.
Sure.
You didn't even get on a plane to go that far like you might today. But he had introduced me to an aspiring actress whose name was Terry Garr. And I was living with her, and she just had a more worldly view than I did, and she convinced me I had to do it.
Okay, so at this point in your life, are you a fan of the Beatles when this all goes down?
Oh, definitely.
Tell us a little bit about when you met the Beatles for the very first time. I mean, it had to just be insane. Here you are, growing up in the States, you're a fan of their music, their publicist invites you over to Europe to hang out and work. What's going through your mind when you first meet the Beatles in person?
I did. Well, I first met them in the first 2 days I was there, really.
Wow.
I mean, I met two of them the first hour I think I was there. And then I met George on the second day, and then Ringo, I guess not for a week or two, whenever it was. He was away doing a movie. But it was kind of unbelievable. I mean, these are people that I had loved. I had waited for their albums to come out, and they didn't seem real to me. So to suddenly come flesh to flesh, it was like, oh my God, what do I do with this? I'm not quite sure how to catalog this one. But, it took a while, but after a while they just became, part of my life.
Hey Jude.
We're speaking to Chris O'Dell, rock's first female tour manager and author of the book Miss O'Dell, My Hard Days and Long Nights with the Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and the women they love.
Hey Jude.
Chris, you sang backup on one of the greatest songs ever recorded, Hey Jude. What was that like? How did you get involved with that?
Well, one of my jobs at Apple was to book the studio sessions, and so I got to where I got to hang. You know, it was not a big deal. I would go hang out in the studio in the evenings after work, and they were at Trident Studios that night, and I went over, and Paul, I was sitting in the control room, and Paul said, "Come on down, we need your voice," which was a little shocking, because I don't think anybody needs my voice. And so I sang.
Now, around this time, you became good friends with Yoko Ono?
Well, actually, no, I became good friends with Patty Boyd.
Oh.
And she's still my best friend. She was married to George Harrison at that time, and then, of course, I was in their wedding when she married Eric Clapton. And Maureen Starkey, Ringo's first wife, and I were very good friends. But Yoko and I never were really friends.
Now, with Patty Boyd, that whole drama must have been crazy. I mean, for those of you that don't know, Eric Clapton ended up stealing Patty Boyd away from George Harrison. What was it like for you to be living right in the middle of that whole situation?
Well, first of all, I was oblivious to what was going on. You know, that I didn't even know Eric had the hots for, so to speak. I was living with Patty and George at that time. You know, it was a difficult time.
Well, difficult to say the least. Old slow hand, you know, all of a sudden turns into fast hands and steals George Harrison's chick. I mean, uncool, Eric.
I actually was very distressed by it because Patty and George were like, they were family, brother and sister almost to me, and so I was very distressed. It was like having my parents divorce. You know what I mean?
Sure.
It was very difficult. So I was very slow to kind of go along with the other relationship.
I don't know how someone controlled you. They bought and sold you.
You were lucky enough to be one of the few people up on top of the Apple building during the Beatles' final performance. Did you all know that that would be the last live gig for the Beatles at the time? What was that like?
Well, no. I knew that they wanted to do a concert, and they had a million other places in mind, and finally they just settled on the roof. And the employees were not supposed to go up there because the roof wasn't particularly stable. And the cameraman, because they filmed it, said as he was going up, he said, "Come on, you know, I want you to help me." So I went up and got one of the prime 4 seats on the roof. And it was just a absolutely wonderful morning. I mean, it was freezing cold, so that was primary. But it was fun to watch, you know, people suddenly wondering where all that music was coming from.
Don't let me down. Don't let me down.
The book is called Miss O'Dell, My Hard Days and Long Nights with the Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and the women they loved. Chris O'Dell is the author. Chris, where can we pick up the book?
The book is actually coming out in paperback on July the 8th.
Oh, perfect.
So I know it's on Amazon right now in the hardcover, but by July 8th it'll be everywhere again.
Let's talk a little bit about the Rolling Stones. You were on their infamous 1972 tour. I mean, what was that like? Had to be bonkers. Completely bonkers.
That was nuts. That was nuts. I worked for them as their personal assistant from about November of 71 up to the tour in L.A., and so I was involved with them daily as their personal assistant. And then when they went on the road, that was actually supposed to be the end of my job. And then Mick called me and asked me to come out on the road and do something, bring something, his costumes. So I got on the tour, and it was like a circus on the road.
Sure.
It was fun,
Yeah.
you know, but you probably had to be high to be there.
And were you?
Absolutely.
It says here that you actually did a drug run for Keith Richards.
It didn't seem like that when I did it, but then when telling the story, someone went, "Oh, you did a drug run for Keith." It's like, that was a drug run? I just thought that was part of my job.
I mean, what a fascinating life you've lived. You're with Mick Jagger, Keith Richards. When you're dealing with Mick, hold on, let me ask you this. Thank God I can edit because I'm stumbling over my words like a 16-year-old girl. I apologize.
Don't edit that part.
Oh, please. You know, all right, break it down for me. You're a personal assistant for the great Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. What does that entail? What exactly goes into that? Break it down for my listeners and myself, because what a fascinating job that must have been.
Well, when I was working for them, they were in LA for 6 months, recording, finishing Exile. And so I would just go to Mick's house every day and, whatever we had to do. Usually there was some business stuff. It had to do with the album, or it had to do with their Stones business. They were still involved with Alan Klein at that time, so they were trying to get out of that. So, there was just, or Keith would call me up and ask me to go to the bank and get him money, and, and I just, whatever had to be done, that's what I did. There was a lot of just helping them with anything, and mostly it was Mick, because he was kind of the person who took charge of everything.
Sure.
I'd go to the studio with him at night, but put just any photo sessions. I'd organize photo sessions, anything that really had to be done during the period of time they were there. And then once we went on tour, it was it was more, will you make sure and get my laundry in tonight?
Right.
It got to be stuff like that.
So many things have changed in the music industry over the last 20, 25 years. Could you describe what the lifestyle was like being on the road with the Stones in '72 during that infamous Exile tour? I mean, it just had to be completely batty.
Well, it was a pretty incredible tour. I think even today they look back at that tour and say it was probably one of the most amazing tours in rock and roll, and I think it was. I mean, they had a private plane, which at that time, it was a converted plane. Which I look at the photos, and it meant that they turned a few seats around, where today they're like totally done out. But, we flew in our own plane. We stayed in the best hotels. We had limousines to take us back and forth from the hotel to the gig and whatever. And, there were a lot of people on the tour. We carried our own doctor, our own drug dealer. I mean, we had everything.
Chris, what gave you the idea to write the book?
Well, one of the things I knew while I was living my life was that I was being put in a very unique position, and that I had watched music history being made. So I think I always thought it would be nice to be able to allow people who weren't there to feel as though they had been there.
Right.
And then then I realized how much our music means to even young kids today. And so that was a lot of it, plus the fact that, I did talk a lot about my own addiction and my own recovery. And I'm an addiction counselor today and a therapist. So, it was kind of also an opportunity to share some with people who went through the same thing or are going through the same thing.
So at the time when all of this is going on, you actually knew you were part of music history. You were able to tell, hey, something magical's going on here.
I could tell because just little things that were like Billy Preston coming into Apple, and I had gotten in touch with his agent and said, have him come to Apple. He came in, he walked downstairs, played with the Beatles, and I went, this is history.
Wow.
And, those kind of things kept happening, and the Beatles on the Roof, I knew that, and so all along I kept, pretty good memory of what was going on. I didn't write things down back then, but it did. In the 80s, I began to write stuff down so I wouldn't completely forget it.
This is just crazy. You've had George Harrison. He's written a song about you called Miss Odell.
That smoke that keeps polluting up our shores is boring me to tease. Why don't you call me Miss Odell?
Leon Russell wrote Hummingbird about you. You've got some of the greats actually writing songs about you. What's that like for you when these great artists, pen a song for you?
I think it's a huge tribute. I just think it's the nicest tribute you could have is for someone to be inspired by you enough to make art, of any kind. And so it's a tribute that no one can ever take away.
Miss O'Dell, you have lived one hell of a life. I can't wait to read the book. It's called Miss O'Dell, My Hard Days and Long Nights with the Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, and the Women They Love. For more information on the book, you can visit Amazon.com and MissO'Dell.com. Chris, I've had a blast speaking with you. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Take care.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.